So we'll start off with Ms. Simons. If you can tell us, did the hospital come up with the design? Did they have instructions that they were giving to the bidders?
The instructions that we had for the bidders were okay. So the instructions we had for the bidders were really informed by our clinical need, and for the country, what the country needed. So our instructions were put out as design specifications, and it might have indicated the range, the height of the building uh, that we needed it to be, that the impact maybe on the environment or lack of impact that we wanted the building to have. Clinically, how many patient rooms we wanted, generally what the size was. Nicole can go into a little bit more detail in terms of how we specified for it. But in terms of the actual design, then we'll send it back to Colin because the design had to evolve around those very clear specifications. I'm gonna talk about clinical.
So the clinical specifications, once we determined what those spaces were, for example, what departments we wanted to put into the new acute care wing, we then had to determine what those departments, what the rooms were that we wanted in those areas, and then the sizing of those rooms, and what support services needed to support those spaces. And then we created a specification around each of those rooms in order to give the bidders some understanding as to what we wanted the building to have in it. They then came up with the final design based on that. So I'll pass it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Nicole. So, Mr. Campbell, can you tell us, did you do this locally? Did you go out and look for an architectural firm that deals with hospitals, that have a lot of experience in building hospitals? How did you decide who was going to be doing the design?
Thank you. I wish I could say that I had a bigger hand in that decision process, but this is a team. Modern hospital construction using the public partnership process is an enormous, complex, interrelated group. The prime contractor, BCM McAlpine and Sir Robert McAlpine, then put out for themselves, they solicited interest from various architects who they were aware of having successfully bid P3 projects in Britain, and they made a selection, and they then came back to Bermuda and said, who would be the best group to work alongside this group? As it turns out, in the mid-'80s, OBM, my company, had worked with Swanky Hayden and Connell on other projects, so we already had a DNA fit, if you will. It also turned out that in 2004, I was part of a team that looked at the estate master plan for the hospital that really looked at not only the hospital, but locations for hospitals, what is the health history of Bermuda, where was it going, and helped start an awful lot of the groundwork for the clinical side of things, where were our health needs going to be. So we started really in 2004. We also helped build the Lam Fogo Clinic out in St. David's as well. So we were well positioned in terms of understanding various players and the needs and just what Bermuda was looking for.
Thanks very much for that. So, for those of you who might not have caught that, Mr. Campbell was saying that Swanky, which is an architectural firm out of Great Britain, were chosen as the architects, and then the local consortium, Paget Health Services, went and got OBMI to join forces with Swanky. So, how did you decide on the design for the building? How did you come up with that?
Well, I won't say it was easy, but it was an evolution, as these things are. We first joined together as a team in late October, early November, the year before the project really got started. I think it's 2009, and we discussed various matters, and we toured the island with the design team. We discussed cost issues, went through all the ground rule. The DCOS, or Design Construction Operation Specification Manual, which was an enormous tome, was delivered to us just before Christmas. I remember everyone going a big groan, oh, I have to read this over Christmas. So in late December, we received the instructions based on the clinical requirements and needs. and many of these follow the Canadian standards, and so we were able then to start picking apart and finding out what was it that was actually being asked for. So that started not one, but 4 designs that we did, as it turns out. In fact, later on there was a 5th. And what I've done here is to show you just a little bit, if I can. When we looked at the DCOS requirements, there was a requirement to have this light filled and to be efficient and all sorts of good things. And essentially what we came up with was a building of this sort of magnitude. It was huge. And so as a consequence, we then said, okay, what could we do then to better understand it and change the dynamics? We were aware of some of the local concerns. And so we changed the footprint of the DCOS plan, which was sort of a C-shaped with an idea of a garden in the center. And we tried a what's called a racetrack style, where you have all the bedroom suites on the outside and services on the inside. We changed it and bent it a little bit to better utilize some of the opportunities of the site, and then we also then compressed the whole thing and made it a square. And we then test fitted it on the land that was available, and we knew from very early on from our costings that underground parking was hideously expensive. And in as much as this project was also going to be measured not only on design and clinical efficiencies but also cost, we wanted to eliminate underground parking if we possibly could. So we struggled with how to place a building on a site for a good long while, and we came up with several test fits. These test fits were done by February of our first meeting, and what we found is, and there was one thing which was kind of a driver as we went through the whole business, that was that the patient care in modern hospitals is reduced in scope from several days to a day and a half or 2 days in and out in this individual care for any numbers of very good reasons. So we then said, okay, what is the effect of the building on the staff? The staff are in the building 24/7. I was reading some details and stuff, and it was just a sidebar comment that medical staff have a very high propensity for cancer. And the reason being is they don't get enough sunlight. Vitamin D as a motivator for antibodies and all that. So that opened up the whole idea. So we took the square, which was, we started evolving towards a square without necessarily fixing on it right away. And we said, okay, what would happen if we took a square, we broke it apart and offset it just a bit so we could get light into each of the patient wards, and each of the patient rooms would have light as well, but also getting light streaming down into the main corridors of the hospital. Would that be something that would enlighten folks? Yes. Pardon the pun. And we also then saw the opportunity of a bit of a skylight, which is always kind of dramatic as well. On part of our tours around Bermuda, we'd seen all the hospitals that the existing hospital, the First Cottage Hospital. We went to the old British Army Military Hospital. We looked at Lamfogo. We looked at a number of critical buildings and a few historical buildings as well, just to get context. And one building that stuck in our minds was the Commissioner's House, which, as we know, has a great wraparound verandas and stuff. But the interesting thing of that building is that in order to get ventilation, they had an inner core that brought light and air right down to the middle. It's a fascinating building if you've not been out to see it. Recommend that. So with that in mind, there were a number of compelling things that were pushing us towards getting things done, but design wasn't the only issue. So we looked at a more modern approach. We looked at the concept of what does it look and feel like. And again, the designers traveling to Bermuda, it's always interesting to listen to someone else's fresh interpretation of Bermuda. As they were taking the ferry out to Dockyard and back, they were most interested in how the houses along the Fairlands foreshore and all around the island seemed to blend into the landscape. And the concept of what was called floating pavilions came into play. And they said, how could we then indicate this, that on this large landscape building we knew was going to be big, how could we then playfully look at that as a concept? So that was all part and parcel to the run-up of the design. Just going beyond that a little bit further, we also looked at what these are called sections, and in these section drawings we're showing the impact of the size of the DCOS building instructions, how we could make our buildings smaller, more compact, and then also how could we get light into the buildings. And in instances here we had a style which is called the racetrack, just a square building, the curve, and then we had the square and up here. And so this was by March of the preceding year, and decisions had to be made and designs had to be finished by June. So we were running 4 designs simultaneously, test fitting them, costing them, and going back and trying to find which one was going to fit best, and then do presentations and run through these presentations. So it took almost 4 out of the 8 months just to get to the shape. okay, without even getting down to all the nitty-gritties and all that sort of good stuff. Okay.
Thanks very much for that. So when you presented, did you present a final design, or did you try to present all four?
You'd be a better judge. We bored everyone to tears. We presented all four, of course, because we were also looking. My job at that point in the presentation was to, whilst the architects were presenting the ideas, going through the clinician benefits and all that stuff, I was watching everyone out in the audience. I wanted to see what their reaction was to the particular designs. And you could tell by people's body language whether or not they were getting it, or whether there was questions and stuff like that. And so after our debrief, after our meetings, we did a debrief on everyone's body language, how they felt about various bits and pieces as well. So it's not just, oh, this is a brilliant design, one off. We did four, and we're running it right up to the last minute. And really, it wasn't until almost April that we finally said, yes, this is the one. Let's start driving in on this now, because now the cost, the budget, the time frames, all the other things are now coming up and meeting it, and fine-tuning the colors and all the other selections. So it was a very intense, very quick, a lot of fun. Everyone is so hyper. It's exhausting fun, but it was good fun, and the presentations were a lot of fun as well.
Thanks for that. So it's my understanding that the chief architect for the project was actually in Britain and wasn't here when the building was actually being erected. How did that work?
Well, as things happen, evolution and all like that. Right now in the architectural practices, firms are growing larger and breaking off and finding new deals. Just a quick correction: Swanky Hayden Connell first got started in the United States, and we worked with the U.S., the New York office as well, Jim Case and the guys, and they then moved to Britain and did their business. Swanky has subsequently, that office has now moved to work with another firm in Britain, and they're giving themselves a little distance from the New York office. The chief architect, or the three we call the three cowboys who ran with the thing out of Britain, because there were at least three of them plus with Jim Case in New York. They were offered a position in another firm, and so they moved on to further their careers. But by the time the decision was made in September of 2010, it was largely, I wouldn't say largely designed. It was the design intent was secure. We had ticked all the boxes. We had met all the requirements for the internals. Now it's over to the technical people. So even if those guys had been in that same office, they wouldn't have been working on the drawings on a day-to-day basis. That would have gone over to a technical team that would have drilled into the details, and that's in fact what happened from there on in.
So then the architects that picked up, they were given the whole spiel on the light and why why the design was the way it was.
Well, no, not really. It's one of those. Theirs was not the reason why. Theirs was a do and die. That was the deal. You had to get it done at that point. So most of the major decisions had been made. It was down now just confirming that equipment fits by inches. That sort of technical detailing and stuff like that. So there really wasn't an awful lot of design decisions per se. The interiors followed through and was signed off by the hospital meeting intent. There were mock-ups of rooms that were done that were signed off by the hospital saying yes, that met the intent. And so there was an awful lot of the follow-up. But the big decisions really had been largely solved by September 2010 and then into the late winter months.
All right, and you've told us that design teams came on the island and went around and looked at different buildings and so forth and so on. I understand that it's because somebody got stranded here that we have the color palette for the inside. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, one of those comments, but the Lord works in mysterious ways. So in the process, I don't know if anyone's memory of 2010 is as exact as ours is. Just reliving this is quite funny. A couple of interesting stories came about it, but the design for the interior colors and the striations, each floor, we know that in hospitals there's a concept called wayfinding, where you color different departments or different levels so people know where they are without having to refer to numbers. Very often people don't speak English or have language difficulties, so they can tell where they are in terms of this thing. In trying to establish that wayfinding, it was a curious circumstance where in the April period that we were presenting here in Bermuda, Paul Tracy brought his family down. And it was school holidays and it wasn't that lovely. And then something called the Iceland volcano blew up, and you may remember that you couldn't fly in or out of Britain for about 2 weeks. Well, Paul Tracy was here for a couple extra 10 days, almost 2 weeks with his kids at the Southampton Princess, which we were just saying, I think he's just about paid the bill by now. And so he had a lot of time on his hands, and he was following along and taking photographs. And he took this sort of the photograph everyone takes of Jobson's Cove. Only he looked at it differently on this particular day. And I can show you that there is an image just over here, but just, sorry. Essentially, you've seen that image of Jobson's Cove, 100 times. Only he looked at it and he sliced it up into the various levels, starting with the sand levels, and then the greenery, the rocks, and then the ocean, the turquoise, right up to the sky, and said, if we break this up, we can then use this as our wayfinding matrix. And it's mentioned on the boards here as you go through as well. So that was sort of a happy circumstances of a volcano helping help define Bermuda's color through the hospital. But color was an integral part of our whole design team approach. I was just sharing a little earlier, and perhaps you'll remember this. Yes. When we first, yeah, I'm always in uniform here. So when we first did our first presentation in Toronto, it was bitterly cold, and we gave the guys instructions to come with a suit and tie, and there was a big groan because many of the fellows coming were artists by nature and wanted to be open neck and all this good stuff. And the BCM team and the OBM team were absolutely convinced that we wanted to look like a team from day one. And so we slipped on down to English Sport Shop and got ourselves our club tie. And it's got all the right colors. It matches the BHB's colors, and so we thought that was pretty clever too. So off we went, and we tipped up, and I had a big bag from English Sport Shop that I went off to Canada with, and we suited everybody up with ties and various outfits. So the design meetings happened. There was 1, 2, 3 teams, and we cycled through 1, 2, 3, and we were the third team. So we were the last team of the day, and I'm sure the board was getting pretty tired of hearing the same old wow, 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 hospital, isn't it great? And so most of the guys had turned up, I assume, in their usual sort of loose and casual an artist look, and out they went. And then we came in, I guess after the lunch break, and we had the ties. And again, my job at that point was observers, start taking notes. And I remember walking into the room, and all the ladies, especially, sitting back and then nudging each other and saying, check these guys, check these guys. So anyway, we had the ties. And the subsequent meetings, we wore the tie again. It became our thing. And then better known, I believe we were better known amongst the groups. So they're trying to remember who are all the various teams, because we're talking about 20 people at a setting. So we were known as the guys with the ties. So right. No, it wasn't. No, didn't have to. So there was our. No, there's no points, but it was a distinguishing factor. So, like I say, this whole process is, well, it's cutthroat actually. I mean, there's an awful lot involved here. So you use every wedge, every advantage you can, and if turning up and looking smart is an advantage, well, goodness gracious, why not do that? So to the point we had this nice little banter, and imagine the fellows from Canada and Britain and Birmingham and all of the prospect of climbing into some Bermuda shorts was a very daunting idea for them. I don't know. So anyway, in the May presentation, we got Mr. Hampshire very kindly opened up the English Sports Shop at 7 o'clock in the morning. We marched everybody in and got them all suited up, and then we went off to our presentation and had a riotous good laugh and good fun. It met the board's approval, and then did our presentations. So we had a lot of fun in the process, and it also cultured the fellows that Bermuda is a very flexible-minded place, but it does have structure, and it does have certain things that really do matter, and it's standouts. And anyway, that was part of the whole process of the design. So it's not just pretty buildings and stuff like that. It's just having your shoes polished. It's good.
Thanks very much. So I'll turn it over to the audience now. I don't know, does anyone have any questions on the design? Okay.
It might be helpful to understand that it was a very competitive process, and it wasn't just that this design came forward and that BHB chose based on a design. again, we had very clear specifications about what we wanted, whether they were technical, the engineering specifications, design. We might have said that we wanted our patients to have access to light and to views, and it was up to each of the competitors to design in a way that pulled those views in. And as much as we might have had an opinion about different designs, that wasn't the only factor that was looked at when the evaluation process occurred. So it was great that, Colin, obviously you can see his energy. That energy has always been there, and that was really good. But it was important that the hospital be very, very clear about what they needed, for patient care. And that's what brought this team through in the end, that they checked a lot of boxes in about 5 different key areas that we were looking at. And that's why they won in addition to their ties. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much.